Welcome back to the deep dive. We are jumping straight in today, looking at some really important research that I think changes how we should view invasive species. Yeah, we're doing a deep dive into a paper called The Cumulative Consequences of Multispecies Invasions in the Great Shuffle of Biodiversity. It's a big review paper led by Kelsey C. Brock from the University of Wyoming and Jared Bernard at the University of Hawaii Mano. And it really forces you to think beyond just, the famous single invaders.
That's exactly it. What this paper does is synthesize a huge amount of evidence, both contemporary stuff and, fascinatingly, paleontological insights from the fossil record. And it's all aimed at understanding how the impacts of multiple non-native species add up or interact when they land in the same ecosystem, and what that means for the future, long term. The context here, the reason it matters so much, is that human activities are essentially tearing down the world's natural geographic barriers. The oceans, the mountains, things that kept life separate for millions of years. What we're really seeing is this massive global restructuring of Earth's biogeography. It's a huge reshuffling of life.
And I really like the term they use for that, the Great Shuffle. It captures the dynamism, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's the process of species moving and mixing. It feels different from older ideas like, say, biotic homogenization, which describes the end result, the pattern where everywhere starts to look the same. The shuffle is the engine driving that.
Exactly. And to really get the scale of this shuffle, you have to think about what it's replacing. For eons, those barriers, that isolation, that's what drove speciation. Think about Darwin's finches, or lemurs in Madagascar, or, even subspecies like the kaibab squirrel on one side of the Grand Canyon. Isolation breeds uniqueness.
Right. And now we've basically thrown out the rule book. Global trade, planes, container ships, they bypass all those barriers at once. A tiny insect that could never cross an ocean on its own can now zip across the globe in a shipping container in, a week?
Yeah.
Its own ability to disperse becomes almost irrelevant.
And the numbers are just staggering. The paper cites at least 37,000 species that have already established populations outside their native ranges. Just think about plants, vascular plants. Around 4% of all known species, something like 14,000 different kinds of plants, have been moved and established somewhere new by humans.
Well, it's like we've created a whole new continent's worth of flora just scattered everywhere. That's huge. And maybe even more concerning is how fast this is happening now. Introductions have been ticking up since the 1800s, sure, but there's been this really sharp spike recently. The authors point out that something like 37% of all new records of non-native species establishing themselves have happened just since 1970. That's pretty recent history. And it's not slowing down. The global pool of these introduced species is projected to grow by another 36% per continent by 2050. It's really accelerating.
And that speed changes everything. We're shifting Earth from the state where regions were biologically distinct, you knew roughly what kind of life to expect in different parts of the world, into this era of really fast, probably permanent mixing, which inevitably means more species encountering each other for the very first time. And that's where these novel interactions and cumulative impacts really start to bite.
Okay, so let's get into that cumulative part, because that feels like the core message here. We're kind of used to focusing on the most wanted list, right? The zebra mussels, the kudzu, the pythons in the Everglades, the single species causing massive, obvious problems. But this paper says we need to look beyond those bad eggs. How do we even start thinking about the combined effects of maybe lots of less dramatic invaders altogether?
Well, that's the big challenge, isn't it? For management especially. Historically, the focus was always on those high-impact species because, well, they were obvious. The underlying assumption was often that if a non-native species only had a minor individual effect, you could probably ignore it. But this cumulative perspective really turns that on its head. You might have 10 invaders, none of which seem catastrophic on their own, but their combined effect could easily be as bad or worse than one really notorious species. The problem is these combined effects are often subtle, they build up slowly, they're hard to measure. That's why the paper calls them cryptic sometimes. They fly under the radar.
All right. And the paper actually gives us a framework for thinking about how these multiple invaders interact. Let's maybe walk through those types. First up are these synergistic effects. That sounds dramatic. It's also called invasional meltdown.
It is dramatic. This is where one invader actually helps another one along, making the overall impact much worse than just adding their individual effects together. It's like a negative feedback loop. The example they use from Christmas Island is frankly terrifying. You had non-native yellow crazy ants. They formed these huge supercolonies because they were basically farming honeydew from non-native scale insects, another invader. These super abundant ants then started killing the native redland crabs, millions of them. Now, these crabs were ecological linchpins. They controlled the forest floor vegetation, and crucially, they ate snail eggs. So once the crabs were gone, another invader, the non-native giant African land snail, which the crabs used to keep in check, was suddenly released. And these snails then invaded the forests, changing the whole ecosystem. It's like ecological dominoes falling, triggered by multiple invaders facilitating each other.
Wow, okay. That's a clear synergy. What about the next type? Additive effects. So they just add up.
Pretty much. This happens when the different invaders use slightly different resources or attack different parts of the native system they occupy, complementary niches, ecologically speaking. So their impacts don't necessarily boost each other, they just stack on top of each other. There's an example from Hawaii concerning the native koa bug. Two different non-native parasitoid wasps were introduced, actually intentionally, to control some other invasive bugs. But unfortunately, both wasps also attack the native koa bug, and it turns out one wasp targets koa bugs at lower elevations and the other prefers mid-elevations. So neither wasp might wipe out the bug on its own across its whole range, but together their combined pressure has basically pushed the remaining koa bugs into only the highest, most restricted mountain habitats. Their impacts, while separate, add up to severely endanger the native bug.
That makes sense. Less dramatic than meltdown, but still really damaging. And the last category is antagonistic effects. Does that mean they fight each other and it helps the native species?
Not usually, no. Antagonistic here means the combined impact is less than the sum of their individual impacts, often because the invaders compete with each other for resources, or maybe one preys on the other. But, and this is key, even if their combined impact is less than additive, the net effect on the native ecosystem can still be really significant, or even worse in some ways. Think about invasive predators in New Zealand, like stoats and rats. They might compete for the same food, like native bird eggs. To avoid direct competition, maybe the stoats shift to hunting more during the day while the rats stick to the night. So from the invader's perspective, they're partitioning their niche, reducing conflict. But from the poor native bird's perspective, now it's being hunted effectively around the clock. The total window of predation pressure has actually increased, even though the invaders are technically interacting antagonistically.
Okay, that's a subtle but important distinction. So even when invaders compete, it doesn't automatically mean things get better for the natives. This all brings up a huge issue, though, which is time. You mentioned the Christmas Island meltdown. Those kinds of complex interactions, they must take time to develop, right? Decades, maybe longer. How can we study that if ecological studies usually only last a few years?
That is precisely the problem with only looking at modern invasions. There are often these really long lag times between when a species arrives and when its full impact, especially its interactions with other invaders, becomes clear. And this is where the paper does something really interesting, I think. It argues we have to look to the past, to deep time. We need to use the paleontological record, the fossil record of ancient biotic exchanges to get a sense of how these mixing events play out over millions of years.
Using fossils to understand modern invasions. How does that work?
Well, there have been other times in Earth's history when continents collided or sea levels changed, allowing previously separated faunas and floras to mix. But there's a critical difference we have to keep in mind. Those ancient events were driven by geology or climate, non-human factors. And crucially, they happened much, much more slowly than the human-driven shuffle happening today.
Right. So if those slow ancient exchanges caused problems, what does that imply about our super fast global mixing event?
It implies, and the paleontological evidence supports this, that the consequences of the modern Great Shuffle are likely to be far more severe. The sheer speed, the global scale, the sheer number and diversity of species we're moving, it's unprecedented. So the fossil record, in this sense, gives us maybe a conservative glimpse of what might be coming. It shows us the kind of disruption that happens, but suggests our current situation could be much worse.
Can you give an example from the fossil record?
Sure. A classic one is the Great American Biotic Interchange. This happened when the Isthmus of Panama rose and connected North and South America, maybe around 2.8 million years ago. South America had been isolated for a long time and had evolved this really unique fauna giant ground sloths, glyptodonts, those amazing flightless terror birds. When the land bridge formed, more generalist North American mammals, especially predators like saber-toothed cats and canids, moved south, and the result was a wave of extinctions among those unique South American endemics. The mixing led to massive biodiversity loss.
Okay, that's a powerful example. Any others?
Yeah, an even older one is from the late Devonian period, way back, like 372 million years ago. Sea levels rose dramatically then, connecting previously isolated marine basins around the world. This allowed widespread, generalist marine species to spread globally, and they tended to outcompete the more specialized species that had evolved in isolation in different regions. It led to a major extinction event and the collapse of vast ancient coral reef systems. And what's really striking looking across these different ancient events is a pattern emerges. The paleontological studies suggest the severity of the ecological chaos and extinction is strongly correlated with two main things: how many species get exchanged and how large the geographic area of mixing is.
And today, we're basically doing a global exchange involving tens of thousands of species.
Yeah,
We're maxing out both those dials.
exactly.
Which really underscores the urgency we see reflected in international policy now, doesn't it? Like Target 6 of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, aiming to halve the rate of new introductions and establishments by 2030. That sounds incredibly ambitious given everything we've just discussed.
It is incredibly ambitious, and the paper points out a really critical knowledge gap that makes achieving that target even harder. Right now, policy often uses the number of new invasions or the rate of introductions as a kind of proxy, a stand-in measure for the actual ecological damage being done. But the scientific link between simply having more invaders arrive and the magnitude of the resulting cumulative harm isn't actually well understood or quantified yet. We assume more invaders equals proportionally more damage, but the dynamic is synergistic, additive, antagonistic, make that relationship really complex. We urgently need research to nail down that connection.
So we need a new way of doing the research then. What does that look like?
Well, the paper argues for a more integrated approach. We need studies that don't just count species, but actually try to quantify the individual impacts of multiple co-occurring invaders. Then we need to classify how they're interacting. Is it synergy, additive, antagonistic? And then ideally build models that can predict how those impacts will accumulate over time and across different landscapes. It's a much more complex picture than just tracking arrival rates.
And that has real-world consequences for conservation now, right? It's not just academic.
Absolutely. It suggests that our standard approach of doing risk assessments on one species at a time might be fundamentally flawed because it misses the bigger picture of interactions. We also need to grapple with this idea of functional redundancy. If you have, say, 3 different invasive predators that all eat the same native bird eggs, maybe getting rid of just one of them won't actually help much, because the ecological role predation on those eggs is still being filled by the other 2 invaders. Removing one might just open up resources for the others to become more abundant. The cumulative impact persists. So we need to think about managing the process of invasion and its collective impacts, not just picking off individual species.
So really the big takeaway message here is, we need to stop underestimating the quiet crowd. Even the invaders that don't seem like headline grabbers on their own, if there are enough of them, interacting in these complex ways.
Yeah.
They can collectively be just as damaging, maybe more so, than the famous worst offenders.
That's it, precisely. The Great Shuffle means the sheer number and interconnectedness of non-native species is becoming a primary driver of ecological change, potentially rivaling the impact of any single superstar invader. We need to look at the whole invasive community. And the truly long-term perspective is, well, it's quite profound. We're already seeing evolution happening in response to this mixing new hybrid species forming between native and non-native species, native insects rapidly adapting to feed on invasive plants. If those ancient, slower biotic exchanges left permanent marks on the course of evolution, sometimes depressing diversification rates for millions of years, as the fossil record hints, what will this unprecedentedly fast, diverse, and global shuffle mean for the future trajectory of life on Earth? It suggests we might be triggering shifts that will echo for evolutionary timescales. We're essentially co-opting the planet's evolutionary future right now.
It really makes you think about this new Pangaea we're inadvertently creating. Every ship, every plane. It's not just moving goods or people. It's actively participating in this vast, uncontrolled ecological experiment. A sobering thought to end on. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.